So here we Good evening. Welcome, everybody. Tonight, we are going to be talking about planning our gardens, some strategies to get a plan together, to get a higher yield out of our gardens, and to be able to fit all the things that we want to in as things come in from, the cold crops and transitioning to the hot crops and then transitioning again to cold crops and things like that. I got a bunch of slides and some concepts to share with you guys. I definitely want to encourage you to put your questions in the chat as we go along. I'll be checking in on the chat from here, from time to time. And so when I have a little bit of a break, and we'll try and address the questions as we go along. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing some of the presentation here. Hold on one second. Excuse me. There it is. Okay. And let me make that bigger. Oops, I didn't want to share it. I wanted to do the slideshow, and there we go. Okay. Just quick slide on This Is Us, Keep Growing Detroit. And this is our mission right here at the top, cultivating a food sovereign city. So today we're going to be talking about creating a planting plan, crop selection, scheduling, and succession planting for the home garden. So this is primarily focused on home gardens and on a slightly smaller scale than some of the larger farms around this, that might be around the city, though most of the, all the concepts apply. We just wanted to have a class in particular that, address the needs of doing things slightly differently on a smaller scale. This is the garden that we're going to be using as an example. This is one of our directors, Ashley's garden, and she shared her photos that were made some drawings of maps and stuff that are going to help illustrate our conversation as we go along here. So as a baseline, we're just asking some of those questions when we're thinking about getting ready to plan our garden. Is, what is the intent? Who are you growing for? What do you love to do? Do you want it for, just for fresh? Are you going to be, doing a lot of cooking? Do you want to store the stuff for later, freezing? Do you want to grow more of, certain varieties to preserve or store for later in the freezer? And so, that's going to help you make some of the decisions on how much to grow of any particular thing. Okay, here's an overview of what we're going to discuss today, and everything's there. Okay, now I can't see everything. That's better. Okay, here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about strategies to kind of illustrate the area that you have to grow in. So that's going to be a really important part of putting together a garden plan, is to set up some kind of garden map or some kind of representation of your garden to use as a tool to work through your garden planning. And then we're going to talk about crop mix. So deciding the crops that you can focus on for planting in a season. What are your, basically what are all of the ones that you want to do, your favorites, the ones that you must have, and then kind of other things that you're interested in growing if you have the space. And just a note here that, particularly for folks who are in the garden resource program, we give out a lot of stuff. We give 3 different distributions of plants, and there's seeds, and there's lots of choices to make. And if you are growing on a small scale, if you just have a few raised beds, it's not very realistic that you're going to be able to grow all of them, or at least grow all of them in any kind of, meaningful way. Unless you just do 1 carrot, and that doesn't really make much sense now, does it? So there are some there is a bit of a reality check that you should have with yourself about, okay, how much space do these things need, and how much should I be actually planting of each particular crop. We'll spend some, and then that leads into the next section is, talking in detail about spacing, and then creating, there's a few different types of tools for actually using that information, thus, area, crop mix, and spacing, etc., for making the actual crop plan. And then as part of the crop plan, there will be, some talk of rotation, of not planting the same thing in the same space year after year, and also ways to extend the growing season. So how to grow a little bit earlier than kind of conventional April through October, or a little bit later in the season. And there's some concepts we'll talk about related to that. Okay, so first off, we're trying to define how much growing area we have to work with. And so it's basically, we need to measure out whatever in-ground beds or raised beds, or whatever you are intending to be your vegetable garden space. If you could define areas that, define the areas, and this is in the upper right hand corner here, this is what we're going to be referencing a lot. And this is again this is a drawing map of what we were, at that image earlier I was talking about, that which is Ashley's garden, her backyard there. So this is a drawing representation, and this is what she put together and we'll look at it. It's a little bit small here, but basically, she drew out this simple map, and you need to have basically put together some kind of map that represents each of the areas that you're growing in. And so and when you're doing that, and this is kind of relates to rotation on some level, is that you should break up, like if there's larger areas, like here, so we're looking at, here's again the backyard, and that's okay. This is going to be much easier to help with this conversation. So this rectangle here with 2 4x10 spaces, it's essentially an 8x10 big rectangle, but she broke it in half so she could have a designation of 2 defined growing areas. And that helps with, okay, one type of crop is going to go in one of those for 1 or 2, and then 1 or 2 is going to go in the other. So you can break it up into sections. You can, whatever, you have to think creatively about how, basically drawing out the entire area that you intend to be growing in, and then thinking about, probably in the neighborhood of 2 by 2, at least 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot areas, or 4 foot by 4 foot areas. Nothing much smaller than 2 foot by 2 foot, I think. But you want to have some sections and defined areas, and you want to label those, right? You need to have, and we're going to use that labeling down the road when we're creating, when we're creating our lists and putting the right crops in the right space for the right correct time of year. Okay, and so in this case, and you can use graph paper, and I'll be, as a note, I'll be sharing the slides and the video presentation from today afterwards. So you can, actually print out your own graph paper from the slides to help you. You could, one way, before I get into that, I'll come back to that. But in this case, for this map, she labeled the beds with letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Okay. If you are using graph paper is really helpful because you can give each square a designation in terms of size. So you could say 1 square equals 2 square feet or 1 square foot. And then you can have a map that's actual size and has an actual representation. The map doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be that way. For some people that's helpful. It's more important that you have, at the very least, you have some kind of designation of the representation of how big the space is. So in this case, it's 4 foot by 10 foot. And that is actually it should say that's the inch marker, but we know that that's a 4 foot by 10 foot bed. Okay. And then after we've defined our beds, we've figured out, a particular way to set up a map for our garden. We're going to start to think about our crop mix. So a crop mix is basically a listing of the things that you want to grow this season. We really recommend, starting out with an extensive list of the things, referencing the things that you grew last year, things that maybe you want more or less of. Always considering trying something new. And then after you've done that, go down that same list and using some of the reference materials that Keep Growing Detroit supplies, which look something like this, and we'll talk more about them in a minute. We're going to, you want to notate if they're days to harvest. So if you're not familiar, days to harvest is just that. It's the time from when you put it in the ground to when you get a harvest. So for seeds, it's for when you plant the seeds, and for the transplants you get, it's from the time that you put the transplant in the ground. So we share these reference materials. This is on our what is called our Plan Your Garden document, which is on the Keep Growing Detroit website. I will share that with you as well as the slides after the class as a future reference. So it gives a listing of all the crops that we distribute, their days to harvest, and their ideal time to plant outdoors, as well as seed and plant spacing. So, and so we've created our list. We've got tomatoes. I'm sure everybody in this call is going to have tomatoes because that's a popular one, but maybe there's that one person that doesn't like tomatoes. But in any case, tomatoes, greens, lettuce, all of okra, peas, goes on and on, right? And so what we want you to do is think about the ones that are the most important to you and start with using those and making sure that you have a space for those in your plan. And then once you've established, okay, I'm going to plant, peas at this time and tomatoes at this time and so on and so forth, then we can start to fill in the gaps of what are open times and spaces in your garden that you could plant other things at different times of the year. So this really ties, it really ties into the concept that, there are early season crops and then they're done. And then there are, there are crops that are, almost all summer. And they take up, they're many more like 60 to 80 days to harvest. And those are the long season crops. And then there's, kind of end of the season crops that you could be planting. So, and what you can do is basically, right next to your list of those crops, you can categorize them as short season, which is less than 45 days, or long season. And that'll help you when you're placing them on your planning tool, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And then, this is just, one of the tools or I guess one of the things that you're going to really need to do when you're planning is really start to familiarize yourself with the crops. Crops are like family and friends and neighbors. They have very unique attributes. So are they cold season or hot season? Are they long season or short season? What is the days to germination for the seeds? What is the days to harvest for those plants? What is the mature height and the growing area? And which crops are ideal for succession in a season? So succession meaning you can grow it, grow one crop and then grow another right after it, and so on. And we'll get into the detail about that in a bit. So again, after you've created your list, now you're going to start, and you've notated on short season or long season. Now you're going to take that list and you're going to notate your top choices, and those are going to be the first ones that you start to build out your plan with. Those are the bones of the plan, so to speak. We're going to figure out where we're going to plant them first, and we'll talk about that more in detail. But let's get into a little bit more about a little bit more detail before we go down that path. So if I know some folks are likely on the call who are growing for the first time this year, but if you did grow last year, that is a really, really important and helpful, referencing what you planted last year is going to be a really useful tool to know what you want to grow this year, because you have a frame of reference, right? If you have any kind of drawing, or from memory, if you can kind of bring together any kind of representation of what you grew last year and reflect on that. And ask yourself these questions. What was growing where? What didn't you use and why didn't you use it? The next one is very important. What did you wish you had more of? And so, that's a note like, oh, I grew 2 collard plants and they were great, but I really wish I had more collards. So that's a note. I'm going to do, based on what I had, I'm going to do a few, 2 more collard plants. What things went really well and what things did you struggle with? And what didn't, and so forth. What is new you might want to try. Okay, how are we doing so far? Any questions? Okay. So in this case, for this example, we're saying, what happened last year? We planted in bed A, peppers and eggplant, in bed B, herbs and flowers, and so on and so forth. I do want to note here that in the reference of for bed D, that was kale, cabbage, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts. And then this / broccoli is when, they did Ashley planted another round of broccoli, or the gardener here planted another round of broccoli. And then lettuce, arugula, beets, and so on. What didn't you use? I got the eggplant, watermelon, and Brussels sprouts, but I just didn't get them in the ground. What do I wish I had more of? I definitely wish I had more of salad greens and cooking greens. What did great? Herbs, tomatoes, and peppers. What did not do well? Cabbage, a real bummer, and so on. That's and what is new you want to try. So trying to get something new in the garden each year is definitely a helpful thing. Okay, we've talked about this, getting to know your crops. Again, this is reference material that we share, and I just want to reflect on this a little bit more, just so you know that this is a reference tool that you have from Keep Growing Detroit. So this is available on our website, and again, I will be sharing it with you in an email after the class. And this is a great thing to use to reference when we're putting together the list of the crops that we want to grow this season. And so, this is just talking about the varieties we're going to be getting for cold crops and hot crops. And this isn't the whole list, but this gives you, a general reference, and, you can look at that further in the future. So again, coming to this is really the important reference point, which is going to help us in identifying those things that are long season and short season, and then the time of year that we're going to be planting them. So as an idea of what to think about. So say you had a particular bed, we'll just call it bed A in the map that we had, we were looking at earlier. And just going straight from the top and saying, okay, I'm planting some arugula. It looks like I can plant it as early as March. And into May. It doesn't like the hot weather. So June and July are not great months, but we're going to try and get it started as soon as the soil is workable in March. And it looks like for baby greens, that's for smaller size, that 21 days is for the smaller size, and the 40 days is for when you want it a little bit bigger. So I know that I want to plant it for a smaller size. So if I'm planting it right around now, it's going to be out of the ground by March in that bed A, and then I'm ready to plant something else like something else that's going to do really well in that time of the year. So maybe maybe it's perfect timing to put some kale in that bed, as an example. And then really paying attention to spacing on both of these, and also related is paying attention to thinning. So in the case of spacing, we're just talking about how far apart to plant the seeds. So this first page is these are all the seeds that we're going to be getting. And in this case, these are the transplants that would be getting from the Garden Resource Program. And it's really important to basically, when we're planting most seeds, we overplant. We use the spacing that they recommend, but we plant. There's more plants that are going to end up sprouting than we will ultimately need. And so we're going to thin those down. Once they've sprouted, we can thin those down to one plant per area at the appropriate spacing as referenced on this chart. And then closely related is the transplants and the spacing for them. So when you get these little transplants, if you're not familiar, they're only like 3 or 4 inches tall, and they don't look like much when you get them. And so when you're going to put them in the ground and you say, okay, 18 inches, 1.5 foot, I'm going to plant a broccoli one, and then and this far apart between the next broccoli plant. Well, ultimately that broccoli plant's going to get to be 2 feet plus tall. And so you need to compensate for that space and give it enough space to grow into. If you're planting things too closely together, they're going to get stressed out and they won't come up to full size. They'll end up getting crowded and shade each other out. And, it's going to be not so much of a harvest, and maybe issues with pests and and other problems in the garden. Okay, and then after you've got that short list and you've placed them on your, you've got together your crop mix, and you started with those first 4 or 5 crops, and you've got them placed on a map that we're going to reference shortly. Then we're going to talk about in adding, filling in the gaps with some of the longer season crops like melons or squashes, for example. Those are more like 80 to 100 days to harvest. And then, and then finally, in the end, you're going to fill in any kind of open spaces on your maps with short season crops. And again, there's going to be some good examples of this stuff. Okay, so in this case, there is for an example, one example of this crop map is in bed A. We have starting out the season with garlic, kale, broccoli, and cabbage, and that's that gives enough space for 3 kale plants and about 12 garlic and 2 broccoli and 3 cabbages and so forth. And then as a succession, the dark text, after those things are harvested, like the garlic will come out in July and the cabbage will finish off about, by, we're usually planting cabbage in April, and it's usually about 60 days. So by the end of June, you should be harvesting, or, roughly about the end of June, you should be harvesting that garlic, or I'm sorry, with that cabbage and pulling it out of the ground. And then you'll have an open bed here. And then and in this case, we're planting scallions and broccoli in that same space. And this map is really helping with that, illustrate that representation for how to get that together for the next season. Okay. So now, before we get into the more dirty details of creating those plans, I do want to reference another thing to consider. When you are planning out your garden, is yield. So how much am I going to get? How much am I going to harvest from that crop? So there are a lot of different references out there for how much to expect off of growing a particular area. Always the best reference is experience. So, like I said earlier, it's really helpful once you start getting, some experience under your belt and you're growing from season to season. You can have a general idea of how much you need to grow of a particular plant for your needs. But there are some good reference materials out there in the seed catalogs. So like, for instance, this is a reference in the Johnny seed catalog, which tells you if you were growing 100-foot row of bush beans, you would get approximately 45 pounds of beans. So 100-foot row would just be one row. Not if it was, so say if it was a 4-foot wide bed, maybe there might be 2 rows inside of that bed. So it's more of one linear row that they're referencing in this case. And you can kind of extrapolate from this number for the smaller scale. So you could, say you only did a 10-foot row, or a 10-foot row could be 2 5-foot rows, and that would equal, about 4.5 pounds of beans, of bush beans, off of 2 5-foot rows. So that gets you in the ballpark of thinking, okay, I know I'm going to make dilly beans this year, and I want to make enough for all of my cousins, and I have 10 cousins, and I want to give them blah blah blah. You can start to think through if you that kind of thing. If you really wanted to get specific, you can really think through some of the numbers. Not every year is the same in terms of like, sometimes you have pest issues, or some years seem to be particularly good, particularly better for one crop or another than others. So it's just it's really just a frame of reference, and particularly, again, experience is a great teacher with this one, with understanding how much you're going to get off of a plant. Um, this is a particularly useful concept for those who are intending to sell their crops. So to just to have an understanding of what they might get out of a growing a particular area. It's worth noting that when you are doing your planning, that some crops take up a lot of space, but are only a one and done harvest. So cabbage is a great example of that. Cabbage, is about 60 days to harvest, and you get one cabbage head. I love cabbage, but I usually don't grow it in my garden because I feel like I would rather grow kale in that spot, which I'll get much more harvest off of over time. And so it's okay, that's a trade-off for me because I have a limited amount of space that I'm working with in my home garden. But if I was, if I had a expansive land, then I'd start to think about, oh, well, I got enough space to work with to budget using growing cabbage, or other examples here is broccoli or Brussels sprouts in that space. Here is another reference chart for estimating yields and this is based on per square foot. So this can give you a sense. So, if we're looking at, beets, you can expect roughly 3/4 of a pound to a little over a pound per square foot if you're planting beets. So if you want to grow 10 pounds of beets, you can grow, you're going to grow somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 square feet to get that much. Okay. I'm definitely opening up for questions. Feel free to come off mute. I think, I feel like if you want to jump in and ask any questions, that's just fine.
I just have a quick question. I want to make sure I'm following correctly. For
Yeah.
the succession plant, should it be in the same family as the previous plant? Like, should I plant all of my brassicas like one after another? How does
Uh-huh.
that work?
Yeah. So it could go either way. We'll get into that into detail. Yeah. I got a couple slides and we'll talk in detail about succession particularly. So if you could hold that question, I'll get into it.
For sure. Thank you.
Uh-huh. And then here's one more reference for estimated yields per square foot. Oh, we talked about this. Okay, great. Spacing, we did talk about this a bit, but essentially, be sure to reference how many plants or seeds do you need to get your desired yield? How far apart do they need to be planted? And how much area will that take? Okay, so basically you're going to use a combination of how much area do I have, and then either referencing how much yield you want to get, or I know I want to grow this many things and I don't care how much I get. I just want to grow this many things, and whatever I get harvest from, that's fine. But you'll get to be familiar with how these things all kind of work together to give you what ultimately, the kind of harvest that you want in the end. I do want to make a note to consider planting the same types of crops, and this kind of relates to the question you were saying, planting the same crops in blocks or rows. So instead of no. So in this case, in section A, these are all in the Brassica family. So we're planting all those things that are related in one block. We're not planting one cabbage in bed A and one cabbage in bed H and one cabbage in bed C. It's not, that kind of helps address the idea of rotation. If you have a really small garden, it doesn't really matter so much, but if you're, as your garden gets bigger than say 10 by 10, this would be recommended, is to keep legs with legs. It'll help make sure that everything gets the amount of light that it really needs, as well as managing for pests. And, there's a couple of different reasons that will be helpful. You will be getting, with the Garden Resource Program, and this is always available, some reference material for, for actual planting in terms of preparing the seed bed, and a little bit of information about hardening off and maybe prepping the seeds by soaking them and that kind of thing. I don't just want to reference that is a tool that you'll have for your reference. And that in part of it included in that is a little bit more information on spacing, and how many plants you would be able to plant in a particular square foot area. So this is just another place that you could reference for, how many. I'm planting lettuce. I'm getting 6 transplants. How much area do I need for that? And that's going to be, in this case, roughly 2 foot by 2 foot area to plant 6 lettuce plants. And then just a quick note to, make sure you have space for flowering plants that really help with pollination, as well as beneficial insects. That there are lots of insects that really help with, that you can attract with flowers, that help with pests, help with pollination, help with the biodiversity of the garden. Okay, so now we're getting into the actual making of our garden plans or maps. There are a few ways to do it. And so this is the first one, which I kind of talked about a little bit, but just a little bit of a review on that is essentially, or the kind of the idea here is that we're going to take our drawing. We're going to have our representation of our garden, which is to the right here, and we have a drawing of all the beds that we're intending to grow in. We have them all labeled with some kind of letter or number or name, some kind of reference that we can use when we're making a list that correlates back to the map. And then we're going to take that and we're going to make a few copies of that. So we're going to take it to put it on our printer, or go to the copy store and make 3 or 4 copies, essentially. And each one of those is going to represent a particular season. And so we're going to, with our list combined with making, a map for each season, we're going to write in what's going to be growing at what particular time of year. So this is just a very simple example. So in bed A, in the spring, I'm going to do just spinach. And because, spinach is a really great one for early springtime. It really tolerates cold weather, even at this time of year when we still might get some frost. You could plant that right now and it would be doing just great. It would be, it's something that could do well. And then Spinach, I know by reading my reference materials that spinach is roughly 30 to 45 days, and I'll be harvesting it. And so I can keep growing that, and I can cut it. I can actually pull off leaves and keep it growing until the last frost, when I know that I need to get ready to plant my tomatoes in that same spot. Okay, so that's for that one bed, that's my plan for my first, it's essentially succession. And that's is one of the ways of succession. And so spinach to tomatoes. Tomatoes are going to be in the garden most of the growing season, and they start to peter out by beginning of October. You can, they're not, you can still kind of keep them going until the frost in October. But one strategy, if you have limited space in particular, would be like, okay, there's only 3 tomatoes or 2 tomatoes left on this plant anyways. Pull up the plant, you harvest those tomatoes green, and just use them for fried green tomatoes or whatever. And then you can do maybe one more planting in that same bed of something like radishes, which is something that is a cool season plant. And I know that it's a short season plant, because I reference my chart and I know it's about 30 days to harvest. So this is just one strategy for making a planting plan, is as drawing out these maps, making a copy for each of the seasons, and filling in, what's going to grow in there, based on your list that you have for reference, and knowing that there's short season or long season and the days to harvest. You could also use your lists and your map in conjunction with a calendar, if you're a calendar person, and that helps you stay on track. I think one of the challenges of garden planning in general, and is just something that's going to remind you that that it's time to plant the next thing, or it's time to get the next thing ready. Because you're just always looking at, oh, I got something growing in the yard, it's filling up the space, I'm good to go. But if you're getting ready for the next thing, then you can maximize the yield out of that space. So we're always trying to think about, okay, this is in now, and when is it done, and what comes after, or what's the very first thing early in the season I can get growing. I'm going to try and get that, get some early season crops growing. And maybe we'll spend some time looking at the list of crops at the end and talk about what would be good for early short season, mid season, and late season, as a conversation towards the end. So before I go on too much further, I just want to answer this question. I'd love to hear you talk more about hardening off. Hardening off is essentially the essential concept of acclimating transplants that have been growing in a warm environment inside a greenhouse, or in a grow, under your grow lights at home, to the outdoors, where the temperatures are fluctuating and they're getting much more intense sunlight. So basically we're hardening off by putting them outside for a few hours on the first day, and bringing them inside at night, maybe leaving them out for the afternoon on the second day, and bringing them in and putting them out. And so it's basically slowly acclimating them to the outdoors by taking them in and out, in kind of intervals, and making it, over the course of 3 to 5 days, slowly acclimating them to those outdoor environment. So again, the other way to use this calendar as a garden planner is have a dedicated calendar. It could be a written one, like we see in the picture here, or you could transfer it into some on your phone or computer on Google Calendar, or one of those types of references. Which actually, one of the cool things about that is you can kind of reuse it over. You could just kind of cut and paste making reoccurring events for planting dates, that, that might be a useful tool um, for strategies for always having a reference for when to plant stuff. Um, they don't have to be particular dates when you're talking about planting dates. It's more about planting in relation to when you're getting ready for the next thing coming out, or going in, or when we're starting things indoors. And so we're in this case, we're right in the columns, or right next to each of the crops that we are listing out here. We are adding when it's to be planted, how many plants or how much area that we intend to plant, and in what location we're intending to plant it. So spinach, enough seed for a 4x8 area, and that we need to figure that out. And then location would be bed A. And this is the third reference material, and this is a tool that larger scale farms also use. But I think that it could have, it's a really great, in my mind, a really great visual aid, even for a small scale. If you like spreadsheets, this is definitely the tool for you. And the concept here is that we have, at the bottom here, we have an illustration of 3 4x8 raised beds. And so the 4x8 raised beds, each of the squares represents a square foot. And then we broke the bed up into 4 sections. So there's section 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 2A, 2B, etc. So there's 3 beds, each broken up into 4 sections. And then we have up here at the top is a representation of the year, of the weeks of the year, and I'm just going to skip to the next slide so you can see slightly better. And it's really focused on the growing area now. So in this case, we have, well, actually, oh, I can't see the beds. So now we have, in bed 1A, I know that I'm going to plant some lettuce, picking up my lettuce plants from the Garden Resource Program in mid-April. I know that they're about 45 days to harvest. And so that bed is going to be that part of 1A, that section of that bed is going to be occupied with those plants until about the beginning of June. And then I'll be able to plant something else. I'm going to give it a break of 2 weeks, and then I'm going to plant bush beans. This isn't like a really amazing planting plan. In particular, this one here right now, like I probably actually would make those beans right at the beginning of June, right after those lettuces. But in any case, you can move this around. You can, you just need to designate a name in where the crop is going to be, of what it's going to be, and then an H represents the harvest. So in the case of collards and kale, they're continuously being harvested, and then at the end of July they're pulled out and another crop is planted. This is another, I think, really good tool. And this is I have a blank version of this that I can share with everybody that you can use for future reference. And you can customize it and make a representation of your configuration at your garden. Okay, a little bit about crop rotation. Very simply put, especially on the really small scale for gardens, is try not to plant the same thing in the same spot every year. Try and move things around. And basically the reason for crop rotation is because each particular crop, and it relates on some level to crop families. First, let's talk about crop families. So crop families are essentially crops that are related. So for example, collards and cabbage and kale and collards are all in the Brassica family. They're all kind of close cousins. So they're all taking the same types of nutrients out of the soil. And so if you plant them in the same spot year after year, you're just depleting the soil of those kind of essential nutrients that they take up. It also can lead to kind of a cascading effect with issues with pests and just other plant related health issues. So we're usually always grouping the types of the families of crops together. So eggplant and tomatoes and peppers is another example. So we would group those together. And then in the next season, we would move them, that family to another part of the garden. I just want to emphasize here that, especially on a small scale, you don't have to be exact on this. Like, if there's one, because, you're growing different amounts of different types of things, there's 10 tomato plants and 2 collard plants. And how do you do that? How do you make that work with a rotation? So I think if you just generally apply the concept of trying not to plant things in the same spot every year and moving things around the garden, and in addition to also trying to keep on top of fertility in terms of adding compost every year or getting a soil test and having an understanding of what your soil fertility needs are, then you should be pretty good to go in terms of crop rotation. So a visual illustration of this is, so we are moving, excuse me, just not coming, the word is not coming to mind. The solanaceous crops, the tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants are in this case moving down, moving down a bed and so on and so forth. Rosalind, you got a question? I see your hand, Rosalind. You got a question for me? Okay, let me know. Okay, Angela.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
First off, hello to everyone. Okay,
Welcome.
kind of new at this. So my question is this: when you start, like I started tomatoes, I started onions. And I noticed I didn't cover anything. Had no concept of what I was doing. I'm just starting. So when you're doing that rotation thing, how do you deal with when you, because my onions are growing now from last year. My sprouts are coming up. They actually never went anywhere. They just kind of laid down in the garden and now they're standing up. So how do you deal with reoccurring growth when you're trying to plant new? I mean, do you just you pull them out and just start over, or?
Yep. I mean, that is one strategy, or you go, okay. So, and you'll get to know onions more as you grow year after year. But what I can tell you about onions is that if it was growing last season and it overwintered in the garden, and not everything can overwinter in the garden, but onions in a relatively mild winter can, certain types of onions, or if maybe it's one of the cousins like garlic chives or the like. But all that to say that they're biennial, which means that they're gonna basically, after they've overwintered, they're gonna go to flower, and there's not gonna be much in the way of the bulb of the onion left because it's putting all that energy into the flower. So you'd probably be just as well to pull them out anyways, unless you just harvested them early for the greens.
I wasn't able to get them and when I went out and checked them like last week when we had the warm day. So I could dig my hand down into the soil, and I mean it was a block of ice in there. where it would actually have started to grow.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't even break through it. It was a block of ice. It was like
Uh-huh.
maybe a hand down in it.
Yeah.
I've got three boards high of raised beds,
Uh-huh.
raised beds, and those when I could put my hand down in it, and it's like my hand was like all the way down in it, and it was a block of ice. I couldn't even move it.
Right. So it's just early in the season yet to do the work, essentially, right? I mean, it's still pretty early, we're lucky. We're really lucky if we can get, we get to working in the garden at this time of year. I mean, it just depends on your situation, but that's not unusual that certain parts of the garden are still frozen at this time of year, and you just can't do much about that until it melts and you're ready for the next thing. You know what I mean? Okay. Rosalind, did you have a question, or we're going to keep going?
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't know you couldn't hear me. Quick question. So you said to rotate. What if you have a plant that comes back, kind of like her question, comes back every year? It's not onions, but it comes back every year. Do you move that and then plant
No.
something different?
Well, that's a choice.
Okay.
It depends on what it is. So like, okay, let's say it was a perennial herb. It was mint.
Uh-huh.
So you're definitely going to not plant mint, move your mint around the garden, because mint likes to spread as it is. So it just, basically you're saying, okay, the mint always stays and everything else moves around it. And when I'm talking about rotation, I'm really talking about just the annual vegetable crops. If it's perennial, the intention is that when you plant a perennial, it's going to live there. It's not going to move. You don't move perennials every year.
Okay, annual. Okay, got you.
Yeah, perennials. I mean, the only reason you're really inclined to move perennials is either to thin them, or to divide them, to propagate them, and or to make it, to start a new bed or give them away, or to regenerate it a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Okay, let's keep moving here. Now we're going to get into that conversation about types of succession planting. I was talking about long season crops earlier. So long season crops, I was just saying, are kind of more than 45 days. The idea is that you would plant that crop and understand, when its season is kind of ended, and then follow it with a short season crop. So the example of the tomatoes, what I was talking about with the tomatoes, and then following those up with some radishes, for example. Another one would be following a short season crop with a long season crop. So that could be early season lettuce, or things that are only take less than 45 days, lettuce, radishes, any kind of like baby salad green mix, things of that sort, and then follow it by what's going to be occupying the space most of the season. And this last one is the one I really want you to pay attention to in the conversation about succession. And this is, I think, is going to get to the question from earlier a bit. So essentially the idea of, in this case, is that, say you want carrots, you want to grow carrots, and you want to have kind of a constant supply of carrots in your garden. And so you designate bed C is going to be your carrot bed for the season. And you just that's just the carrot bed. And, but you don't plant the whole bed in carrots all at once. Because that means roughly 60 days later, you're going to have all these carrots that are ready. And fortunately, carrots can hang out in the garden for a period, but after a while, they will start to get tough. If the same concept with radishes. You can't leave radishes too long because they'll start to go to seed. So essentially when they're ready, you got to pull them out. But what I want you to do with this concept of succession is on the first, on the first week you intend to plant, just plant, based on your yields or based on your estimate, a section of that garden bed C with carrot seeds. So maybe you just plant a 2-foot row of carrot seeds. And then 2 weeks later, right next to that, you plant another 2-foot row. And then 2 weeks later, another 2-foot row, and so on and so forth. And then that staggers the harvest time. So you're basically setting yourself up to be able to have, a certain amount of carrots coming out of the garden every couple of weeks instead of a bunch of carrots already at once. So this applies well to some crops and not so well to others. All the root crops it really works well for, so radishes and beets and carrots, turnips, parsnips. And it doesn't really work well for the long season crops because they only have, they have a limited time that they're taking up most of the season anyway. So, and staggering them doesn't, if you stagger them too much, you're going to end up on the too far into the cold season and they're not going to do well. But you could do, it works well with, you could do a succession of beans. So bush beans, for example, they do, I think I don't remember off the top of my head on this one. I think it's maybe 55 days you start getting harvest around 30 or 40 days, a month or month and a half after you plant them. But they'll kind of peter out after a time. So if if you don't, and this, it requires restraint on some level because the inclination is like, okay, it's spring and I have to fill my entire garden right now because it's spring. But if you have a plan and you're like, no, I'm planting this many beans now in a couple of weeks, or however long the interval you want it to be, I'm going to plant some more, and that will offset your harvests. So and that's and this is where the really the meat and the kind of beauty of planting a garden really comes together, is this ability to do these successions and get more yield out of a particular area. I think if you think, if you think about it, the inclination is like, okay, just like I was saying earlier, just fill up the space, and I'll get as much yield as possible because it's all full. But that's, you could extend that, or you could have more yield over time if you stagger your plantings. So there's some tools for that. This is another example. This is one of the tools available, and it's basically helps you. You fill in some of the information, and it generates a little planting date schedule for you. For instance, if with the beans, if I wanted to have a stagger of plantings, that'll populate my calendar that every 10 days in this case. So I know that these beans are 55 days to harvest, and I'm going to be, I know I want to do a 10-day interval between plantings to stagger my harvesting. And so that it populates a calendar for you on the dates to plant those to keep you on track. Angela, you got another question?
I do. Because again, like I said, this is new to me, and not being someone who's new to this, I don't have an understanding of how long, when to plant, what to plant. And then you're talking about staggering. And so how do I know when to plant something and then to wait to plant something, the same thing later, if and time that within that season. Because
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of being kind of mind-boggling right
Yeah,
now.
I'm sorry. And I know it might be overwhelming, but I think it comes back to familiarizing yourself with getting to know crops. Oh, where's it at? Well, and so it comes in, the short answer is it comes in time. So, you know, you can read the catalogs. You can, as if you want to read up on stuff, there's lots of reference materials. And I would recommend that you check out, the resources that we provide with the Garden Resource Program that are going to help you with that. So that's where tools like this are going to be helpful to you, right? So this tool here, right? So you want to grow cucumbers, and it says, okay, it's 58 days to harvest. So I know that's a long season crop. When can I plant cucumbers? They're a fruiting crop, and I know that actually Keep Growing Detroit helps me a little bit because they only distribute them after the last frost for the hot crop distribution. But they're a warm season crop. They don't, most fruiting crops that have anything with seeds on it in it likely is yeah. So essentially we're trying to plant cucumbers in the beginning of, as soon as the beginning of May. And then, we're going to start to see a harvest by July, because we know that there's 60 days. So May, 2 months later, June, July. Does that kind of help? Essentially, it's not anything that, there's no simple rules around any of these things, because each of these crops are particularly unique. But generally speaking, there's cold crops which as the name indicates, they can tolerate cold temperatures, and they can tolerate frost. They tend to be things that are rooting crops. They tend to be things that are leafing crops like lettuces and kales and collards. And then things that are fruiting crops are like the hot crops would be that do not like cold temperatures, would be everything categorized as hot crops, and that's tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, and the list goes on. Okay. Any more questions related to that? And so here are a few strategies for oh no, I'm sorry, this is getting into season extension. So season extension is really the conversation about, and this is really the concept about if we know that our standard growing season is March through, or I'm sorry, April through October, are there ways to kind of eke out getting things into the ground earlier or planting them later? So, and this is, usually season extension is coupled with some kind of protection, whether that be using, some kind of hoops and row cover, something similar to the images in this picture. But, things that can tolerate cold, a few good examples are the spinach, lettuce, and mustard. So we're going to try and get those. In my garden, the soil is actually relatively workable. And so we already tried starting some spinach out there. Another note for being able to start seeds early in the season is related to, putting your garden to to bed properly at the end of the season. So, or, some strategies to put your garden in bed at the end of the season. So if you mulch your beds with leaves or straw, that helps buffer the freezing of the soil, and that'll really temper your ability to be able to plant seeds in the soil to be not frozen and workable. So you could peel those that mulch back, pull it back and start to plant those seeds in the area. And then, there are other methods of season extension would be, if you're using some kind of tools like the quick hoops or the row cover here, and then later in the season, towards the end of the season, you could get a late planting of carrots, for example, in the ground. So, if it's, we know that basically the ability for plants to actively grow is based on day length. And, we know that gardens need at least, most garden plants need at least 10 hours of sunlight to be actively growing. And by the beginning of November to roughly the beginning of November, that's when our day lengths dip below that 10-hour threshold. So we're really trying to, if we're late in the season, we're trying to extend the growing season. We're trying to get the plants that can tolerate a little bit of cold, like the carrots and the radishes and the beets and the leafy greens, all those things that are leafy greens and root crops in this case, which can tolerate that cold. And we're going to get them a little bit of protection, whether that be or get them established before that, working backwards from that November date. And then we're also going to give them a little bit of protection with either something like the quick hoops here, or straw or mulch. Okay, so that is the baseline of my presentation today. I will go back and I want to talk about some of these other crops in specific. We're going to look at the list and talk them through a little bit, but let's open it up for questions. So let me know what you got.
I just have one question for the cold crops. I did get in some carrots and some beets in the ground, similar to what was mentioned earlier when the temperature was a little warm last week. What are the watering requirements? Can I just leave it up to nature until things warm up, or should I be mindful of watering?
Well, yeah, I mean, so basically because it's, the ground right now, it's been raining a decent amount, so that helps you. You just have to be, seeds you want to keep consistently moist until they germinate. So the seeds need two things to germinate. They need humidity or moisture, and they need a certain, they need a temperature, they need to be a certain temperature to germinate. So, awesome. That's I'm excited for you that you were able to get some things in the ground while we had some good weather. And they may, when we have weeks like this where it's like feels like winter again, they may just kind of hang out for a little bit. But as soon as we start to, and this is going to happen over the next few weeks, those days are going to start to, we're going to get a lot more consistent warm weather, and they should pop for you. But just check on them. Like, I would say they likely wouldn't dry out, but it's possible, but you're probably fine. So, mostly don't have to worry about, just peek at them and make sure that they don't need the water.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Aaliyah. I'm a neophyte, so this is all brand new to me. in your opinion, are there any seeds or crops that are more suited to the beginner as opposed to something that might be a little bit more complicated and over our head? So anything that you would recommend for beginners?
Yeah. Okay, well, we got a list in front of us right here, right? I would say most of these things are pretty reasonable to grow. They're not very hard to grow. The things that I would say that are maybe slightly more challenging would be things that are a few examples would be like that are heavy feeders and are just a little bit finicky. So Brussels sprouts, a little bit finicky, heavy feeder. Fennel, I've heard, people have had, like mixed reviews on how well they work, how well they grow. Yeah, most of these things that, if you just follow the simple instructions on making sure that they get planted properly and the spacing is right, you're probably in good shape. Tomatoes are, they're really easy to grow. I guess most everything on this list is, I would say, is not that hard to grow. There are a few outliers, like I had mentioned, Brussels sprouts, etc. But as long as you're, considering those baseline things of, does it have enough space? Does it have good fertility? Am I making sure I have adequate sunlight and watering well? And you're probably going to be in pretty good shape.
Okay, thank you.
Angela.
Hi, again, I have another question about gardening with tomatoes. I grew the I think they're called Roman tomatoes last year.
Romas.
And those I saw a video where someone had a hoop in the raised bed. I'm gonna go with the brick. So what I'm considering doing is doing a hoop from bed to bed. And what I'm curious about is, can I hoop? Because once they start to grow up, they need to grow on a vine. So what I'm curious about is, can I hoop 2 beds of tomatoes, 2 different types of tomatoes through a hoop, over a hoop? Can I do that? So that when they grow, they're growing up for this lack of, I'm saying hoop, but I really mean that the netting, so like when they
Are you talking about tomato cage?
when you like, so when they grow up, they're growing over and it's like an actual walkthrough. You know what I mean? If I put 2 beds side by side and then hoop them with the cage,
like
so that when
an
they start
archway.
to, thank you. Can I do that with 2 different types of tomatoes is what I'm asking, from each bed? Is that possible to do?
Tomatoes grow wild. They grow lots of vines in different directions.
I know.
So I'm not sure I would recommend them for that application. I think that's something like pole beans would probably be a better fit for that, going over an arch. Because you're just gonna have, because like you're gonna have, the vines are gonna go like this, and then the fruit is gonna be hanging below, right? And so if you're trying to be like where you can walk through the archway.
Yeah, I thought that would make it easier to to get to them if they're hanging through the walkway.
I mean, they're, and the other thing is, like, they do grow long and tall, but it takes, a good part of the season to get there, and it depends on the tomato variety. I mean, have fun with it and be creative. And it sounds like it, it would be an interesting, aesthetically cool idea, but functionally, I'm just not sure that tomatoes are going to be the best fit for an arch. I know typically people either do some kind of the tomato cages, or they just take a stake and put one stake next to each plant, and they trellis it to the stake, and that helps with establishing its giving it structure. And there is no that works just great for harvesting and being able to get to the fruit and everything.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, I'm going to ask, there's a bunch of hands raised. I'm going to ask a few folks who haven't gone yet. Olga? You there, Olga?
Yes, this is Olga. Thank you. Do you have any suggestions from plants on the list for combinations to reduce or control weed production?
To reduce weeds. Strategies for dealing with weeds. So there's basically weeds, just like everything else that's growing in the ground, needs sunlight and space to grow and thrive. So weeds are going to, but weeds have the advantage of evolving in such a way that they can, they can thrive in situations where other plants cannot thrive. So it depends on the weeds that you're dealing with generally, but I think one of the best ways to keep weeds in check is to use straw or shredded leaves as a mulch around your plants once you get the planting established. So that prevents the little seedlings that pop up from the weed seeds, limits their ability to access light and stunts their growth. So that is one strategy. Your concept of like, are there ones that could limit that? And in theory, like once the garden is filled out with, like, say, for example, you have collard plants, and if you have, several collard plants and the canopies of them all are big enough that they're touching each other, they're shading out the soil below and also limiting, the ability for weeds to get established and thrive. So, but I think really the mulching is going to be your best bet, because that, that's going to take time for that plant to establish itself big enough to do that kind of shading out. But I can almost guarantee you're still going to have to pull some weeds. Unfortunately, that's just the facts of life. Okay, who wants to go next? Dot?
Yes. Do you have a recipe for a soil compost mix for raised beds? Some say 60% topsoil, 30% compost, 10% potting soil.
I don't see any reason to put potting soil in there. We just, I mean, practically speaking, depends on how many beds you're filling, but if you're getting it delivered, then you can't ask the landscape place to give you a 60-40. You can say 50-50 and you'll be lucky if you get that. But I mean, generally speaking, that's what we recommend. We tell people 50% topsoil, 50% compost, and that seems to work out really well for folks. So it's enough, soil for, some of the minerals, and it gives the soil is for the structure. And then the compost really helps with fertility and water retention and aeration and all that. So those two together work out pretty well.
Okay, another question. I acquired two metal containers that are about 4 feet by 2 feet, and they're probably 2.5, 3 feet deep. Is there anything I can put in the bottom so I don't have to put so much soil in there? Just take up space.
Yeah, how big in diameter is it again?
They're like 4 feet by 2 feet.
Okay. So they're narrow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Similar. Yeah, that's getting into like, there's this kind of line, this fine line between when it's like a raised bed, it's pretty close to being like an in-ground bed, and a 50 compost makes more sense. But when you're into like narrower, like 2 feet, you're getting close to being closer to a pot. And so you don't want it to be too heavy of a mix, because you can get compaction in the soil. But that said, to answer your question, I use old cell packs, or like it could even be plastic bottles, or you can do rocks, like just something to fill in the bottom, and making sure that you have at least 10 to 12 inches of just the soil mix for the plants to establish in. It doesn't need to be, super deep. So plants, most plants' root zones live within 12 to 18 inches.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Remy?
Yes. Earlier you mentioned that the Brussels sprouts was the one thing on the list that will kind of give us some trouble. Can you give some more insight into what the trouble is? And when I attempted to grow them last year, I really had a fight with aphids. Can you suggest any strategies for attacking them?
Yeah. So Brussels sprouts are they're heavy feeders, which means that like they basically they need a lot of fertility to really form sprouts. They need adequate spacing. So you need to make sure that you have that 18 inches between plants. And I think that you just need to be on top of particularly like, using some kind of regular organic fertilizer feeding to give them what they need to produce those sprouts toward the end of the season. Some people also will remove some of the bigger leaves to encourage the sprouts to grow. Aphids are basically there's a couple different things that you can do. You can blast them off with a strong stream of water. So they're soft-bodied insects. So even though they're kind of gross, they're not super hard to address. So usually that's the first thing to do, is to try and knock back the population with a really strong blast of water, being careful not to damage the plant. Things like Brussels sprouts can tolerate, some strong water, but if it was something like lettuce, that would be a different story. And the other option would be making basically a insecticidal soap solution, which is basically using a non-detergent soap, something like Dr. Bronner's, or one of the simpler soaps that don't have detergent in them. Tablespoon of that, a half a teaspoon of cayenne pepper, and like a half quart of water, and shake that up. And what that does is it irritates them with the cayenne, and the soap is what's called a surfactant, which covers their skin, and it makes it hard for them to breathe, and it can help knock them back. But you just have to be persistent. You have to come through, you have to blast or wipe off all sides of the plant to knock them back.
Okay. And when you're blasting them off, there's no concern about them crawling back up to the plant?
There's going to be some of that, but you're killing some of them in the process. So it's a give and take.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's what I had, for the presentation today. I'm open to answering more questions if folks want. If not, we can wrap it up a little bit early. Okay, great. Tanya, what you got?
What's some good flowers? Can you hear me? Oh, well,
Yep. Uh-huh.
okay. What are some good flowers to add for pollination?
Ooh, boy, you caught me off guard. I don't know. Let's see. Um, there there's a really good resource that MSU Extension has that talks about a lot of the flowers that are really good for, you're talking about what I was talking about earlier with beneficials, I'm assuming.
Correct, yes.
So I can make, I'll add that to my list of things to share with you guys. But other than that is, I think if you think of planting perennial, planting in kind of groupings. So for instance, well, first you want to know plants. So things with umbel flowers. So things that are related to dill, dill as an herb is good. Oh boy, they're just not coming to the top of my brain right now. I can share a list with you. I'll share a reference list with you after the class.
Okay, thank you.
Ashaki coming through. Okay, Ashaki's got borage, zinnia, comfrey, marigold. So those are the things that Ashaki mentioned in the chat, and then Linda is saying lavender as well. I mean, I think the general concept is like you're trying to strategize to have things flowering in your garden consistently through the season. So a combination of annuals and perennials. And then, like when I share the list out, focus on some particular ones that are really good for some of the parasitic wasps and things that are help with dealing with some of the but marigolds and zinnias and the ones that I've mentioned are among those that would be useful. Jessica.
Hey everybody, how you doing?
Hey.
I my question is kind of from last class. I don't know how much soil I need for the trees. I'm not sure how big they are. So when we plant, how much soil should I get done? I have 3 trees.
So this question is just for the rest of the folks, just to give context, is about the perennial fruit sale. We just closed up, and Jessica ordered some fruit trees, and they're going to be coming bare root. They're going to be roughly 4 feet in length and about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. So it's going to be kind of like a long stick with some roots on the bottom of them. And when you are establishing new fruit trees, you want to incorporate some compost into the spot that you're digging up for the soil. So first off, it's good to know the quality of the soil that you're working with. Hopefully it's decent stuff, but if it's rough, you might even want to get some topsoil to that as well. Oh, Carol, thanks for coming through with that pollinators reference. That's what I was talking about. I would say, you're digging up for one tree, you're digging up a hole that's roughly 2 foot wide and 2 foot deep. So, I'm guessing that some of the soil there is decent. So you're really just trying to incorporate some compost and maybe some topsoil into that. So 1/4 of a yard or half a yard, if you get, 2 or 3 5-gallon buckets of compost and 2 or 3, depending on the quality of the soil.
So it's better to buy bags from like whatever store or get it dumped.
I don't know if you need there's only 3 trees, so getting a dump is gonna cost more, and I don't know if you need to get that much. I mean, there is compost at the resource centers or a few of the resource centers. Not the west side one though. But compost will be coming. Actually, compost should be by the beginning of April. So you should be good. You should be able to pick up compost.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to ask, I can't remember where I got my containers from, my water containers for the
totes.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Where did we get those from? I can't remember.
You know, there's not a great source anymore. Basically, we want to, when we're getting the 275 gallon totes, we want them to be food grade. There used to be a few places that sold them, but they're, you know, I don't think you can't really find them from them anymore. So the best luck that I've had is checking on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist.
Okay.
You could also like check around to, I know that like Detroit City Distillery, like some of the local distilleries will get like bulk alcohol in them or whatever. And so you could maybe source them from there. But I've had reasonable luck with Craigslist. And, you know, so
Okay.
they shouldn't cost more. Ideally, hopefully they don't cost much more than $100 each.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, and Tanya, I don't know if you saw in the chat, but Carol posted a link to that pollinators document that I was referencing that would be helpful for you for perennials that are good for pollinator habitat.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, it was good to have you guys. Thanks for coming out. Hopefully I gave you some good information, some helpful information. And so we'll see you at the next one. I'm going to answer Olga's question here. Let's see. I have an apple tree damaged by crabgrass the first year in planting. This year appears to have 3 leader branches 2 inches from the ground. I bent 2 of the leaders to give the prominent one room. What is your opinion? I'm not sure how crabgrass damage is. Are you just saying it? Is the tree actually damaged? Can you come off mute, Olga? Olga, you still there?
Oh, yes, yes, I'm off mute. What happened? It was last year it was damaged. I think I told you earlier I had to kind of dig the tree up and remove the crabgrass from the roots. I didn't know what I was doing. I had purchased this tree at a store, but it survived through the winter. And this year the leaders are very healthy and one is very prominent and healthy. So I bent the other 2 back to give that prominent one room to, you know, grow. Should I cut the other 2 off or should I leave them there? Because I don't want to damage it any further. But I want that prominent leader to have room to spread out and take prominence and then eventually perhaps cut off the other 2 sides. What is your opinion on that? It's healthy. It's much healthier this year, but it has recovered.
Right. And so have you heard me talk about the graft union and there's a scion, there's the rootstock, and then there's a part where all trees are grafted, most all fruit trees are grafted. And where they graft is important to note. So you want to, if those sprouts are coming up below where that graft is, you know, that is a situation where it's the root stock trying to take over, and it's probably a different variety than what you're looking to have. So I guess that's one thing to make note of, but anyways, any way you see it, if you're saying there's 3 main branches coming out from the main trunk, the bottom, then
Right.
I would probably eliminate 2 of those and let one.
Just go ahead and let that one just thrive. Now, when I do that, should I put compost around the bottom of the tree or mulch it so that because it's going to have that base with the lopped off branches? So how should I protect them? Should I put glue on them or something, or some type of turmeric? I heard, that when you lop them off like that, they're more prone to disease.
How thick are they?
They're about the size of a broom handle.
Um, that'll heal. You
So I
just
could
want to
just
cut,
go.
you want to just cut it. You don't want to cut it into a stub. You want to cut it like right at the collar, and the collar is where it kind of starts to it starts to flare out. It's kind of curved out.
Oh, okay. I'll cut it there because it really has recovered. It appears to have recovered. Now, what should I just add compost around it as well, or just keep it mulched with straw?
I don't know if you need to, like, if you don't necessarily need to add compost. I mean, adding fertilizer once a year or so is not a bad idea, but mulching is just fine.
And do you know anything about roses?
A little bit.
Okay, with my rose bushes, I fertilized them last week, right prior to the start of the rain, with the milky substance that prevents black spot and things like that.
Uh-huh.
So I treated it with that, and I was thinking I was going to prune them after the first frost, or do you think I should prune them a little earlier?
My experience with roses is to wait till they start to leaf out, because
Okay, good.
you're like, always been pruning, you're first removing dead, diseased, and dying. And then after that, you're shaping. In the case of roses, you're shaping them. And then what I was taught is prune back to 5. So like, some petioles will have, it'll be 5 in a cluster, and then some will be 3. So you're pruning back, you're kind of shaping, and you're heading back each of the leaders, but you can't know where the 5 is until they leaf out. You know what I mean?
Right. So yeah, I usually okay, good. Last year I waited until that point in time, and I'll do that again this year. Do you put compost? Usually I just give my roses like a can of I have like a little fish water, fish mulch, or do you put compost around your roses at all?